Welcome back, everybody. Today I am going to delve deeper into a book that I spoke about on my last podcast, which is The Assault of Truth, The Assault on Truth by Jeffrey Moussaif Masson. The first question I want to ask is, did Freud stop believing children? So normally on this channel, we talk about family courts, child protection, and the experiences of parents who feel the system failed them. But today, I want to take you back more than 100 years, because I think I've found the beginning of a story that may still affect us today. For those of you who have followed this channel for a while, you'll know that 16 years ago, I lost my relationship with my child following family court proceedings. Like many parents, I believed that if a child disclosed sexual abuse, the most important question would be, what happened to this child? Instead, my experience was that attention gradually shifted towards me. Was I mistaken? Had I misunderstood? Had I somehow influenced my child? Those questions have stayed with me for 16 years. I've often wondered whether this way of thinking is something modern or whether its roots go much deeper. Then I came across this book. Now, before I go any further, I want to be completely honest with you. I haven't finished reading it. I'm about halfway through, but already I've reached the point where I simply couldn't wait to share what I'm discovering. So instead of pretending I'm an expert who's already reached all the answers, I'd like you to come on this journey with me. We'll read this book together. We'll look at Freud's own writings. We'll look at the evidence Masson relies upon. We'll look at what historians agree with and what they dispute. Because this isn't about proving Jeffrey Masson right. It's about asking whether there's something in this history that still deserves our attention. Most people have heard of Sigmund Freud. He's often called the father of psychoanalysis. His ideas changed psychology forever. Even people who've never read Freud have probably heard terms like the unconscious, repression, or Freudian slip. But here's something I didn't know. He believed something very different. In the 1890s, Freud was treating women suffering from conditions that doctors of the time called hysteria. Many of these women described deeply distressing experiences from childhood. According to Freud's early work, these were not simply unpleasant memories. They were accounts of sexual abuse. Jeffrey Masson argues that when Freud carefully listened to these women, he reached a conclusion that shocked even himself. In his correspondence with his close friend Wilhelm Fliess, Freud wrestled with the implications of what he believed he was hearing. If his early theory was correct, then many of the alleged perpetrators were not strangers. They were fathers. Think about how explosive that idea would have been in respectable Victorian society. Families were expected to be the safest place in the world. Fathers were regarded as moral authorities. To suggest that sexual abuse might be occurring within respectable families challenged the very foundation of society. According to Masson, Freud was standing on the edge of one of the greatest discoveries in the history of psychology. And then everything changed. Within a short time, Freud abandoned what became known as the seduction theory. Instead of believing that many of these accounts described real events, he increasingly developed a theory that placed much greater emphasis on unconscious fantasy, internal conflict, and psychological processes. Why? That's the question Jeffrey Masson tries to answer. Masson believes Freud retreated because the implications of believing his patients were simply too great. Other historians disagree. They argue Freud genuinely changed his scientific thinking as he developed psychoanalysis. One of the things I want to do in this series is separate those two positions. Not because I want to tell you what to believe, but because I think this debate deserves to be understood properly. As I was reading, however, one story stopped me in my tracks. It wasn't about Freud's theories. It wasn't about psychology. It was about a young woman called Emma Eckstein. And what happened to her made me put the book down and simply stare into space. Because if Masson's account is accurate, it raises a question that goes far beyond 19th century Vienna. It raises a question about what happens when respected professionals are faced with evidence that one of their own has caused terrible harm. And that's where we'll begin next. Emma Eckstein. When I reached the chapter about Emma Eckstein, I had to stop reading for a while. Not because it was difficult to understand, because it was difficult to believe. Emma Eckstein was a young woman living in Vienna. She became one of Freud's patients. At the time, Freud was working very closely with a man called Wilhelm Fliess. Fliess was an ear, nose and throat surgeon. The two men admired each other enormously. Freud trusted him. In fact, they exchanged hundreds of letters discussing medicine, psychology, and their theories about the human mind. But Fliess also believed something that today sounds extraordinary. He believed there was a direct connection between the nose and the sexual organs. He called his theory nasal reflex neurosis. According to Fliess, many physical illnesses and emotional problems could be traced back to the nose. He believed that disorders affecting women, including what doctors then called hysteria, could be treated by operating on the nasal passages. He even believed there was a connection between the nose and sexual behaviour, including masturbation. Now today, most of us would probably find that idea bizarre, but we have to remember the world they were living in. Victorian medicine viewed masturbation very differently from the way modern medicine does. Doctors and moralists wrote frightening warnings claiming it could cause mental illness, physical weakness, nervous disorders, and even insanity. Looking back now, we know those beliefs were not supported by reliable scientific evidence. But in the late 19th century, they influenced medical thinking far more than they should have. Emma Eckstein placed her trust in these doctors. She underwent nasal surgery performed by Wilhelm Fliess. At first, everything appeared normal. Then something went terribly wrong. Emma began suffering repeated and catastrophic hemorrhages. She wasn't just having a nosebleed. She was losing extraordinary amounts of blood. Freud was called urgently to see her. Imagine the scene. A frightened young woman, doctors desperately trying to understand why she was bleeding so heavily. According to the historical accounts, another surgeon eventually examined Emma's nose. What he discovered was horrifying. A long strip of surgical gauze had been left inside the wound. In the book it said it was about 1.5 meters. It had been forgotten during the operation. As the gauze was removed, Emma reportedly began bleeding so heavily that those present feared she might die. In the book, it said she just turned white and had no pulse. Just think about that for a moment. A young woman had undergone an operation she believed would help her. Instead, a surgical mistake almost cost her life. You might think that would have been the end of the story, a terrible error, an admission of responsibility, a lesson learned. But according to Jeffrey Masson, that isn't what happened. Masson argues that Freud found it difficult to accept that his close friend had caused such devastating harm. Instead of placing all the responsibility on the botched operation, Masson says Freud increasingly interpreted Emma's reactions through the language of psychology. In other words, rather than seeing only the consequence of a grave surgical error, Freud also looked for explanations in Emma's emotional state. Some historians argue that Freud's position was more complicated than Masson suggests, and they caution against reducing the episode to a single interpretation. I think that's important to acknowledge, but whatever view you take of Freud's response, some facts are not in dispute. Emma Eckstein underwent surgery. Surgical gauze was left inside her nose. She suffered devastating hemorrhages, and she came frighteningly close to losing her life. As I read those pages, I found myself asking a question. How difficult is it for any profession to admit that one of its own has made a catastrophic mistake? Whether it's medicine, psychology, the legal profession, or the family courts. Do institutions always find it easy to acknowledge when something has gone terribly wrong? Or is there sometimes a natural human tendency to explain away uncomfortable evidence rather than confront it? The question stayed with me long after I closed the book. Because suddenly this wasn't simply a story about Freud. It was becoming a story about something much bigger. It was becoming a story about belief, about power, about professional authority, and about what happens when the account given by the person who has suffered harm conflicts with the reputation of the professional standing in front of them. That, I believe, is one of the central questions running through the assault on truth. And it's also the question that made me start thinking about today's family courts in a very different way. So, section 3, what has this got to do with today? At this point, you might be wondering, what has a story from Vienna in the 1890s got to do with family courts in Britain today? That's exactly the question I ask myself. After all, more than 100 years have passed. Psychology has changed. Medicine has changed. Society has changed. So why does this history matter? For me, it matters because of one simple question. Who do we believe? When a child says they have been abused, who do we believe? When a mother says she is frightened for a child, who do we believe? And when those allegations are made against someone who appears respectable, who do we believe then? Those questions are just as important today as they were in Freud's time. As many of you know, this channel exists because of my own experience. 16 years ago, I lost my relationship with my child following family court proceedings. I have lived with that loss every single day. Like every parent in that position, I have asked myself countless times whether things could have been different, whether someone somewhere might simply have listened. Over the years, I've also heard from many other parents. Their stories are not identical. Every family is different, every case is different, but certain themes appear again and again. Parents describe children making disclosures of abuse. They describe trying to seek help. Then, instead of feeling that the allegation itself became the central issue, they felt the attention shifted towards the parent raising the concern. Some mothers describe being accused of influencing their children. Others describe being told that they had coached them. Some say they were portrayed as hostile to contact between the child and the other parent. Those are deeply distressing experiences. They are also experiences that researchers have begun to study. Researchers at the University of Manchester, sorry, I've just gone too far. Oh dear, sorry. Researchers at the University of Manchester have interviewed mothers involved in private family law proceedings after they raised concerns about child sexual abuse or domestic abuse. Many of the women they interviewed described feeling that they themselves became the focus of professional concern. Some reported that allegations they raised were minimised or dismissed. Others described severe emotional and psychological consequences from the proceedings themselves. I agree, it nearly sent me crazy. It was so awful, it was so painful. The researchers did not conclude that every allegation was true, nor did they conclude that every court reaches the wrong decision. What they did conclude was that these mothers' experiences deserve serious attention and further investigation. I think that distinction matters, because asking questions about the way a system operates is not the same as saying every individual case has been decided incorrectly. Family courts deal with some of the most difficult decisions imaginable. Judges have to consider conflicting accounts, disputed evidence, and the welfare of children. Those decisions are rarely straightforward. But recognising that complexity should never prevent us from asking difficult questions. If parents, researchers and legal professionals are all raising concerns about particular patterns, surely those concerns deserve to be examined carefully rather than dismissed out of hand. One issue that has generated significant debate is the allegation that some protective parents are characterised as influencing or coaching their children after abuse disclosures. There are those who argue that this happens too often. Others argue that courts must remain alert to the possibility that children can sometimes be influenced during highly conflicted separations. Those are competing viewpoints. They deserve to be examined honestly. For me, however, this is not just an academic discussion, it is personal. When I began reading The Assault on Truth, I couldn't help wondering whether the central question of the book still echoes today. Not whether Freud is responsible for modern family courts, that would be far too simplistic, but whether ideas about disbelief, about credibility, about authority, and about those voices are trusted, and about whose voices are trusted, can continue to shape institutions long after the original theories themselves have faded into history. Perhaps that is why this book affected me so deeply, because I recognised something, not certainty, not proof, but an echo that I feel I have lived with for the last 16 years. And that is why I think this history matters. I'd just like to read something from this book, The Assault on Truth. Sexual assaults, such as Freud described them in the 1896 papers, have been entirely relegated to the fantasy life of the child, or to the lies of the hysterical women. The corresponding truth is now called an excess of parental affection. So it minimises the mother and what the child's saying. So in the next episode, I hope you found that interesting. If you could subscribe and like and share. In the next episode, we'll look at the letter that changed everything. And after Freud passed away, there came another psychologist that carried on the theme. I won't say his name right now, but I really hope that you've enjoyed this episode. And can you please look at a few of my other videos? I want to try and get my channel moving again after having a little bit of a break from, I think it was February to recently. So anyway, thank you for listening.